Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor, and today I'm going to be talking about the passing of the legendary games designer James Ward. James Ward, also known as Jim Ward, was born in 1951. Not much is known about his younger years, except he was an avid reader of science fiction and fantasy, who also worked as a substitute teacher at the time. One fateful day in 1974, Jim Ward went to his local smoke shop to pick up some books. You see, back then, they had a bunch of cheaper books on sale, and he wanted to grab several he had been eyeing for a while. He goes through and gets a stack of 7 books. As he reaches for his last book, it is taken by another patron before he gets in. Not thinking much of it, James simply grabs another copy and looks over to see who has shared his interest. Before him was a middle-aged man who was dressed kind of like a biker with jeans and a jacket. They shared a smile before they noticed they had the exact same 7 books in their stack. They immediately bonded over this and began recommending other books to each other. They also started discussing which of the 2 versions of Conan the Barbarian, Robert E. Howard or L. Sprague de Camp's, was superior, when the biker man mentioned there was a game that he was working on that would allow James to play Conan. Excited by this offer, James took down his address and added one Gary Gygax to his contact book. When Jim arrived at his house, Gary introduced him to his wife Mary, his son Ernie, and business partner Brian Bloom, who failed to sell Jim a copy of this new game because Jim was too poor. Jim eventually rolled up a wizard who was given the light spell, and they were off. In a blog post I'm going to link below, Jim goes into detail over his first game. He would later find out that he was part of the first beta testers for a little module called the Isle of the Ape. I actually did a full review of this module and a rewrite to make it better, linked here. Jim would go on to tell how he had an amazing time in the module, however he couldn't quite figure out the dice. He said it would take him years to figure them out, and even then he never felt like he got them right. So a funny story from during the module. He cast the light spell and woke up a bunch of natives, and they immediately killed the whole party. He said this was the most fun night of his life. When he arrived next week, eager to play and make a new character, he was excited to hear that they were saved by a wish spell Ernie had kept just in case. Clever kid. James Ward was hooked. He began coming over regularly and playing games more and more. He even remarked that he would gladly come work for Gary Gygax if Gary could pay his equivalent substitute teacher salary, a mere $9,700 a year. While he was hanging out with them, James realized there was a severe lack of science fiction content in the game. So, James asked Gary if he intended to make any, and Gary said he did not have the time. James then decided he was going to do it himself, and thus Metamorphosis Alpha was born. Metamorphosis Alpha is possibly the first science fiction tabletop game. It has unfortunately been mostly forgotten these days, but it is kept alive by its fans. So why only possibly first? The reason some people don't think so is we don't actually know the date it came out. We simply know the year. 1976. Well, that's not entirely true. TSR and other people related to them claimed it came out in July. However, if we look at the copyright date, that's not until November. Another game which has been largely forgotten, called Starfaring, was both copyrighted and released in 1976. Fun fact, this is the year before Traveller came out, and Traveller would basically become the go-to science fiction game from here on out. Something I find quite interesting is Starfaring was published by a company called Flying Buffalo Incorporated. Flying Buffalo Inc. has a very interesting story, and they were TSR's main competitor early on. You see, Flying Buffalo released their games, Tunnels and Trolls, less than a year after the original printing of Dungeons & Dragons, making them the second roleplay game ever commercially available. This is why the topic of who was the first science fiction roleplay game is so contentious. Flying Buffalo Inc. is still around, by the way, making them the oldest existing continuous pen and paper role-playing game publisher in the world, which is pretty cool. There is a cool anecdote I want to cover real quick. James talks about how he and several of the other designers were playing through the adventure path Vault of the Drow. They had just finished it, and all of a sudden a powerful dwarf NPC decided to come along. This was strange because Gary literally never had NPCs join the party unless they asked for it, but this dwarf insisted. Early in the night, they found a magical room, and inside this room was a portal. After checking the portal and making sure everything was fine, they all stepped through into a large, cold metal room. Big mistake, because as they stepped through, the portal shut. Eagerly, everybody sat there waiting to see what came forth, when Gary stood up from his seat at the head of the table. For years, he had always been sitting there, being their dungeon master, and he looked at Jim and said, "Why don't you come over here for tonight?" Jim was in shock. He then slowly got up, walked over, and took the seat, and then sat there for a moment, the players looking at him confused and excited. Gary then took Jim's seat at the table, pulling out a character sheet for that NPC dwarf. Gary then told Jim, "Go to your car and get the rules for Metamorphosis Alpha," and they would run it a little bit tonight. James pulled out the Starship Warden, and that's what they ran. What an absolutely awesome way to introduce players to a game. Way to go, Gary. Now, what's interesting here is the Starship Warden was the pre-included setting for the Metamorphosis Alpha rule set. This was their mega dungeon, their Castle Greyhawk. I recommend you go track down either a copy or a blog post about this for more details, but what I find awesome right now is the Starship Warden was a colony ship that had gotten lost in space and suffered the ill effects of radiation and terrible storms. The perfect setting for a mega dungeon, filled with robots, mutants, and far worse. Quick tangent, if you're interested in science fiction and the idea of a colony ship interests you, that is actually the important subject of my first book review, Homestead Among the Stars. You can watch that review here or go pick up that book on Amazon. Both will be linked below. Something else really cool about Metamorphosis Alpha is James actually controls the copyright to it. This allowed him to publish updated games and license it out to other people, unlike the other products that we'll cover in a moment. Following his successful game of Metamorphosis Alpha, James would go on to create another roleplay game. This is one some of you may have heard of, and it's still being played today. It is known as Gamma World. Gamma World is the first post-apocalyptic RPG. Gamma World would go on to have 7 editions, with the most recent one being updated in 2010. James Ward would only work on a handful of these editions, however, and Gamma World served as inspiration for generations. Tim Kaine, the creator of Fallout, specifically cited Gamma World as the inspiration for his post-apocalyptic game, Fallout. He did say the mechanics were not very balanced, however, he loved the richness of the setting, and when they got around to designing their own game, he couldn't get Gamma World out of his head. This is the last book James would work on at this time. It is Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. This is the 4th and final expansion to the 1st edition of D&D. Technically, other books such as Swords and Spells came out after, but they offer more of the same, and Gods, Demigods, and Heroes was officially the last book to add new rules and mechanics to the game. The book covers a huge swath of pantheons throughout history, from Indian to Chinese to Norse, and most notably Finnish. The Finnish mythologies are surprisingly important to the development of original D&D, as the magic system they use is almost the one Gary decided, but he settled on using Vancian magic instead. What's strange about this book is they included several other fantasy settings, such as Conan and Elric, without real permission. TSR was small, and this probably went unnoticed, but would have dire consequences later on. By the way, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video so the channel can grow. Now back to Jim. From here, Jim would finally be hired by TSR in 1980. Yeah, that's right, he made all these products as a freelancer before finally getting hired full-time as an inventory controller. Jim has several fun stories about the time he worked at TSR as an inventory controller. The first was how he had to find a way to get enough dice for a game that was selling 100,000 units a month. He found a company in Hong Kong that would do the dice at a rate they could accept, and they were all doing well. One of the vice presidents, though, came in and decided they were going to make the dice in-house. However, there was a bunch of shenanigans where they kept telling people they had gotten dice molds when they had not, and they started to threaten James and his job. Eventually, it became critical to the point where they would not have dice for several months, so James went around the VP and went straight to Gary and explained it to him. The VP was reprimanded, and James had won the battle. Something interesting, though. If you recall earlier, James could not understand the dice, which is a fun bit of irony, seeing how he became the dice czar. However, for 3 months they had to print these cardboard tokens. Due to the legal system around prisons and dice and gambling, these versions of D&D are the only ones you can legally play in prison, which makes them highly beloved by prisoners. Interesting food for thought. It is at this time that Jim Ward makes one of the most important books to the hobby, Deities and Demigods. Now, you might be confused because I just talked about this book, right? Not quite. See, that was gods, demigods, and heroes. This is Deities and Demigods. Totally different. Deities and Demigods was written for AD&D. This is often called the first edition, with the previous version being known as 0th edition, or OD&D. So this book is mostly reworking of the previous one, with clearer language, more pantheons, better research, and more gameable content. However, TSR was a much bigger company at this point. It had been 4 years since the last book, and now other game companies had started up. They also secured the existing rights to IPs and planned to use them in their games. See, this is where the legal trouble started. The Elric mythos and the Call of Cthulhu mythos were included because James Ward had gotten in contact with publishers of these books and sought permission to use them. They said yes and gave him a letter. However, these publishers had also just sold the rights to these IPs in tabletop gaming to a company called Chaosium. Chaosium didn't know about this agreement, so when Deities and Demigods was published, they sued. Instead of fighting it in court, which they would have won in my opinion, TSR opted to settle. This is one of the most pivotal early lawsuits in gaming, as it helped establish what can and can't be owned by companies and law the way that it is played in the industry. This is why they are so protective of their IPs today. James Ward is innocent though. Although Chaosium claims there was never any letter given since they never saw it, Michael Moorcock came out and stated in writing there was, and James should not be given any flack for this. James even offered to redo the 2 sections for TSR with new pantheons. However, TSR simply sold the book at the same price and was glad to save money on the printing cost of a reduced page count. This work also introduced a number of now iconic Dungeons & Dragons deities, such as Corellon Lyrthian, Garg Glittergold, Grumsh, Moradin, and Yondadal. James has some other stories from working at TSR. While they were working on 2nd edition, a whole controversy about devils and demons came about, the Satanic Panic. People insisted that you could summon devils using the 1st edition of the game, which we know is not true, but that didn't stop people from throwing a fit. During this time, people who were against D&D would show up at conventions and try to argue with people. During one of these conventions, James saw another employee, who was a Christian, politely stand up and debate this person. This man was Dave Conant, and he basically discovered that nobody had actually read the D&D rules. We don't need to raid Satan to know he's evil. This inspired James to simply remove devils from the game by changing their name. The moment they did that, everybody was happy because since they didn't read the rules anyway, they heard devils were removed and they didn't see the word devil was in the book and assumed they had won. This is why there are no demons, devils, and other evil creatures like that in the 2nd edition of the game. From here, James works on a variety of products, including a D&D line for classroom education, until 1984. You see, due to mismanagement, the company was bankrupt and they had to cut staff. They cut 3 rounds of employees, with James being in the 3rd round. From here, James designed several card games for properties such as Tomb Raider and Wheel of Time. He also was allowed to freelance for TSR, making small one-on-one books like Ace of Aces. These sold well enough that 16 months later, one of the accountants realized they were paying James more money after firing him than it cost to have him on full time, so they brought him back in. This was around the time Gary Gygax was forced out of the company, though. The company had a major shakeup then, and it eventually ended with James being given control of the Greyhawk setting and James being promoted to Vice President of Production. During this time, he worked on many projects such as a laser tag game, a video game known as Ruins of Adventure based on the Pools of Radiance adventure path, and he finished with Greyhawk Adventures. Greyhawk Adventures is a fantastic book that breaks down and explains the world of Greyhawk so perfectly, the book is still being used by many gamers today. In 1989, James Ward was inducted to the Academy of Adventuring Gaming Arts and Design Hall of Fame. He also earned a plaque for $2 million in sales at TSR. He was finally recognized for his worth. James continued to work for TSR until 1996, when they called him into the main office. They told him he was doing great, but they wanted to boost their numbers a bit before the next earning call, and asked him to fire 20 staff so they could show a reduction in cost. James refused, and they fired him later that day. After he left TSR, James Ward worked on many other products for a large variety of companies. Some examples here are, he made the Dragon Ball Z collectible card game. He co-founded Fast Forward Entertainment. He eventually worked with Trollord Games and helped with some supplements. Trollord Games is the same company that Gary Gygax went to in the 2000s before his passing, and they make the Castles and Crusade system. He ran their weekly magazine called Crusader. He also went back to working on Metamorphosis Alpha with a new adventure. They all died at the International Space Station. James is also immortalized in his wizard, Dramanji, which is James Ward spelled backwards. So if you ever wonder why that guy's on the Council of 8 with wizards, now you know. James was unfortunately diagnosed with a neurological condition, and he passed away March 18th, 2024 at the age of 72. Thank you, James, for all your hard work. You will be missed. That is all for today. Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed the content, I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed. I'm looking forward to your candor and your comments below, and have a great day. It's funny, I was wondering if it was too abrupt of an end to the video, but I feel like it's thematically relevant since, well, his life has been cut short. Well, I suppose 72 isn't short, but you get the picture.